Well, my name's Kelly Dudley, and I have the privilege of doing the last session, which of course is the hardest to keep everyone's attention. So I drew the short straw. I am currently a student, but I have worked for the past 11 years with the kids you're working with and their families before they get to you. I'm trying to keep them out of your place. So today I'm going to kind of talk about more sexual assault and then predatory behavior. Any ideas, just throw them out at me. What are some causes for sexual assault? What are the reasons?
They've been assaulted themselves.
Okay. Prior victimization? Absolutely. Come on, I know you guys know.
Control.
Yes. Anger, domination, sexual frustration, right? So these are the main reasons that we see for sexual assault. A lot of professionals will tell you that really power, domination, and anger are probably the top three. We see with the kids that we work with, previous victimization, which Mickey mentioned as a sexual reaction type behavior. When I was a caseworker, at one point I had about half of my caseload was juvenile offenders, sexual offenders. Every single one of them had been previously victimized. And so we want to be careful in understanding the difference between predatory behavior and that sexual reaction of children in their previous victimization. But we understand how power and domination, anger, that sexual assault is really not always even about the acts of sex. It's not the sexual gratification that they get from the actual sex. The predator really is more sexually aroused by the vulnerability and their ability to control and to dominate. We see things like sexual frustration and probably more pertinent to juvenile sexual curiosity when that's combined with poor boundaries, previous victimizations, all of that kind of stuff goes together. The only other one we didn't talk about is rape myths. Any idea what rape myths would be? It could be just some misconceptions about rapes. It also has to do with, well, the way she was dressed. I mean, come on, she's kind of asking for that to happen, right? Like she didn't really say no. She said no, but she's just supposed to say no, and eventually she'll like it. As long as I didn't physically hurt the victim, then it doesn't really matter because rape is more about the physical violence part, and the sex just doesn't really matter. So it's all those kind of misconceptions that predators, sexual offenders will kind of tell themselves in order to justify their behavior. To tell you how prevalent it can be in our society, this is some self-disclosure on my part. I get a lot of my news feed over Twitter. So it's like 140 characters or whatever, and I'm reading about the girl that was drugged and kidnapped and then sexually assaulted after being at a nightclub down here. I've worked with this population for 11 years. I work at the Victim Center. I do all this kind of schooling and training, and my immediate reaction is like, well, what was she thinking being at that nightclub and accepting a drink from a stranger, right? That shouldn't have been my immediate reaction. It's totally false because nobody ever asked for it. It's never okay. But it is so inundated sometimes with those rape myths. Previous victimization, when we talk about kids that have had prior experiences, I mentioned that a lot of my clientele had also been previously victimized and then they were in turn offending. I had one kid who was 11 at the time that he was on my caseload. He had been sexually abused by his father for years. His dad ended up going to jail for 25 to 30 years. So that tells you how much proof that they had that this was a major criminal act. Even after years of therapy, he could never actually articulate what had happened to him. He would never actually even admit that his dad had done anything, even though we knew. This is after years of therapy. He was in a locked facility, residential facility, doing great, getting along great with all the other kids, doing pretty good in school, doing good with staff, except for every once in a while, he would still offend. He would claim he didn't remember offending. He would claim that he didn't do it. And we don't know, maybe he was so fragmented in his psyche because he was never willing to address. So there's some major psychological ramifications there that, like Mickey said, the sooner that we can handle that, the rates of recidivism in those types of children that have poor boundaries, that have been prior victimized themselves, are very low. So Finkelhor's a guy who has done just a lot of work on sexual assault, and he says there's basically 4 things that need to line up in order for a sexual assault to take place. Number 1, factors that enhance motivation to sexual abuse. So this is basically your deviant sexual arousal. Think your ilias and your isms, your pedophilia, fecophilia, voyeurism, exhibitionism, masochism, sadism, all those type of deviant, more sexual. It's hard to identify necessarily normative standards. Like we've talked about, it's so unique and there's such a variety. But we can identify deviant, and so it has to do with focus on one of those type of things, the frequency of the sexual act, and interpersonal relationship during sexual acts. Factors that reduce internal inhibition. It's the belief in the rape myths. It's justifying your behavior internally so that you're okay with what you're about to do. Factors that reduce external inhibitions, it's location and opportunity. Factors that reduce victim resistance, this is the looking for the most vulnerable victim that you can control. When those things align, that's when it will occur. So this is common characteristics specific to juvenile offenders. Like Mickey mentioned, we don't have a proper screening tool that is in the works right now, but we do have some common characteristics of what we see of people who are offending. They're typically male, 12 to 17, which makes sense with all of the developmental stuff that we've learned. We kind of see it like this, and then around 11, 12, it really escalates and plateaus there. 20 to 50% have a history of physical abuse. 40 to 80% have a history of sexual abuse. Exposure to aggressive role models. A lot of times this comes in the form of domestic violence in the home. Exposure to pornography at a young age. So this isn't your curious 13-year-old who finds a nudie magazine or goes online or whatever. This is your 6, 7, 8-year-olds that have had continual exposure to hardcore pornography. History of a substance abuse, that can be either by the juvenile themselves or within the home. Up to 80% have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. So those are the disorders you're going to hear a lot about: conduct disorders, oppositional defiant, intermittent explosive, attachment disorders, post-traumatic stress. Conduct problems, antisocial behaviors, we're going to stick on that in just a minute. Difficulties with impulse control and judgment, like not rocket science, right? Like this makes sense. 30 to 60% exhibit learning disabilities and academic dysfunction. So one of the things you're looking at is just a strange correlation that we're beginning to understand more and more, and it has to do with both sexually offending and just conduct problems in general, is that these kids don't have as many successes socially or academically. In fact, a lot of them have completely average IQs, if not higher, but they'll score lower in their verbal IQs, which has to do with listening, memory, remembering things, problem solving, which also, incidentally, is kind of how we connect with each other, right? So they're not really connecting socially. There's some developmental theorists, like Erik Erikson, if you're familiar with him, he'll say it's so important for children to have successes in social or academic or something like that during their elementary years. Well, our children that are struggling with conduct problems and antisocial behavior don't have that. And so they have their frustrations are increased. And when their frustrations are increased, there's more aggressive behavior. So it's kind of this cycle. They can't get along with friends, they can't do well at school, they get frustrated, they act out, can't do along, and it just keeps going and escalates. They obviously have fewer positive interactions with people, just by nature of the things that they're doing and then the way that they treat people and act. They'll have more punishments, fewer social skills, academic skills should be there with it, which leads to a lower self-esteem. And just like all of us, they have friendships with like-minded people. And so our antisocial behavior kids are becoming friends with the other children who have antisocial behaviors. A hostile attribution bias. The long and short of that, they interpret everything negative. So if there is especially kind of a muddled intention of something that somebody is doing to them, it will be negative. Everything in their world is interpreted to you don't like me, you're out to get me, it's all negative. And family problems. There's actually a study that showed children that had learning disabilities and family problems were 4 times likely to exhibit aggressive behavior than just if they had one of those factors. So we're seeing that learning disabilities and family problems. And then the idea is that this is something that's been modeled to them for quite a while at home. And so it's then interpreted into other areas of their life. A lot of youth in custody. Okay, so I'm working with these families before they come to you, so I do know some of them, right? I know that they're chaotic families. I know that their families have probably experienced some stuff with law enforcement, treatment, drug treatment, child welfare, things like that. They lack appropriate role models. They have not had appropriate behaviors modeled for them. History of significant trauma. Many of them have their own experiences with physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. And then we know that development's affected by incarceration because they're not in their family. They are not at liberty to assert their independence, right? It's a little bit more difficult to really sexually be curious and kind of go through all of those things because there's such a controlled environment. So you've got these youth that are going through puberty, that have the hormones raging, that are experiencing these cognitive developments and social-emotional developments, but they're in a lockdown environment, and they don't have a lot of liberty to try to choose some of those decisions. And so that can be frustrating. And then they can feel angry. And then they can want to try to take control and have some power in their situation. So a brief model of prevention. Education, this is prevention for sexual assault or for anybody to offend, or rehabilitation after someone does offend. Because we do know, like Mickey said, juvenile offenders have much lower rates of recidivism if there is a intervention. Education, basic education. I used to train foster parents, and they would tell me, oh no, I got this, because they've already raised 5 of their own kids. I'm like, I know you know how to raise kids, but do you know how to raise these kids? Because they don't have the normal boundaries. They have not been modeled appropriate behavior in a lot of situations. So it's date education. Just because you buy her dinner doesn't mean you get to have sex with her. It's social cue errors. So if a guy walks by a girl and smiles at her, what does the girl think? Guess. If a guy walks by a girl and the guy smiles at the girl, what does she think?
He likes me.
He's nice. It's usually he's nice. Oh, he must be a nice guy. If the girl walks by a guy and smiles at him, she definitely wants me. She's totally into me. So there's social cue errors and trying to correct some of that type of stuff, gender myths and all the different things that teenagers have in their head that are incorrect. Understanding their responsibility when it comes to rape, and that alcohol is not a defense. Just because you had been drinking, it doesn't matter. Personal responsibility. Victim empathy is the second one. Understanding the victim's experience, the difference between guys and girls and their experiences, the psychological and physical consequences to this crime. And this is a hard one for this population because that emotional extension doesn't really happen very often for them. And so the easiest way, or the most simplistic way that I saw in doing this, was figuring out who they're most connected to, whether it's their sister or their mom or their grandma or their best friend, and what if it happened to her? What if you're sitting with her and talking this through, and you see how upset and how this has affected her? How does that make you feel? And then the basic outcome expectancy. If this is what you do, this is the consequence to it. Social consequences, what are people going to say about you? What is it going to be like to find another significant other if you have rape in your history? Finding a job, the legal ramifications, the expenses that go along with all of that. Basic outcome expectancy. Like Mickey said, most of it starts with deception. It's mostly the people that are already in our lives. There's actually 2 types of predators that we kind of mainly put them into categories. There is the power predator. They're the ones that are more rare. They come in strong and hard. They're usually stranger rapes. They're usually like the breaking and entering in a dark alley kind of things. There's no questioning what they're doing. There's no misunderstanding. They've come to sexually assault you. The more common is actually the persuasion predator. We liken them to a shark. They kind of circle their prey for a long time, and they find the most vulnerable person that they can control, and then they'll kind of like push in a little boundary and see what everybody's reaction to it. They spend a long time building a different persona that, if ever accused, people would say, no, it couldn't have been him or her. no, they're such a nice guy. They're so compliant. She's so good, and she would never really do that because it's such a manipulative type predatory experience.
Isn't it like prepping?
Yeah, we call it grooming.
Grooming.
Absolutely. So this first quote, this lady's written a bunch of books on, and she does a lot of interviews with deviant sexual behavior. But most child molestation and even most rapes begin not with violence but deception. And so we want to, I mean, this is kind of like the practical part for you guys in your shifts, is detecting deception. And obviously that goes to any deviant behavior. I mean, this is kind of across the board. She says, where our illusions become dangerous is when they cause us to assume specific people and situations are not dangerous, when they allow us to assume the best about others without considering the worst. Greene County, I know, has a great reputation. I've never heard anything negative about the juvenile detention center there, and I know that currently this is not an issue for you. But I think where we start to fall is when we kind of let that guard down. And I know for me, after 11 years in the field, you make certain connections with people. You let your guard down in certain areas. We all bring in our own assumptions about people. And so this quote always helped me go back to, okay, who's the kid on my case right now, or the family on my case right now that I think is just doing great, that is, I don't really ever have any concerns. And going back and really considering what is the worst thing that could happen. Going back into the times of the day and the schedule or in the areas of your facility that you feel like are really safe, and reevaluating that. Reevaluating your biases and your illusions about what is currently happening so that you are completely aware with your eyes wide open. Detecting deception. So what is the number one way we're told that we can tell somebody's lying? How do you think?
Looking in the eye.
Right. It's eye contact. Every time people will say that. But the funny thing is that with skilled liars, and the thing you have going for you is that a lot of times juveniles think they're skilled liars, but they're not. With skilled liars and a lot of predators, they do not experience the same physiological reaction that the average person does when they're lying. So eye contact, nervousness, sweating, or fidgety behavior is usually how we think we can tell people are lying, but that's really more if people are nervous or feeling guilty.
Body language to me.
Yes. So skilled liars, they don't feel nervous or anxious or guilty about lying to you. They're actually getting something that we call a duping delight. They get a high off of it, but the fact that they are totally pulling it over. And eye contact is the first thing that they learn to fake, because they know if they look you in the eye, you're going to believe them, because that's what we're taught to look for. So here are some other things that you're kind of taking into consideration. Emotional leakage. So it's any of that just hidden emotion that's kind of coming out. I used to see this a lot with my teenage girls because they try to be really hard and you give them some bad information and they're like, no, I don't care. I'm not upset about it, but you just see it all over their face, right? Facial expressions. I don't know if you guys saw that show, Lie to Me, like that used to be on Fox, but he would study the micro-expressions and the squelched emotions, and if it was a real smile or if it wasn't, if the whole face was smiling. They say if somebody holds an initial facial reaction longer than 10 seconds, it's probably phony. It's like if that's really drawn out. Body language. Somebody who talks with their hands a lot, like me, if they stop, they might be lying. Oh, so it might be a way to tell if Marie's lying.
I would say if you handcuff Marie, she won't be.
It's true. And then if you saw her not doing that all of a sudden, totally on her own, would you not think something might be up?
Yeah,
right?
This ain't Marie, yeah.
Or my other favorite one with body language is emblems. So it's like those universal signs like that we know kind of what they mean. I could do some other things with my fingers, but I won't on camera. And so we know what that is kind of trying to communicate. And I had one kid who was just this big, tough kid. He was diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. And he could really, really go off. And he so badly wanted to be in a less restrictive facility, constantly going before the judge. And I would let him present that to the judge, and the judge would always strike him down, right? Well, he had such anger issues. And so we would be sitting while the judge is talking, he's trying to put on a good face. And as the judge talking, you just see his fists clench. And so I see that a lot in juvenile boys. Like they're trying to hold it together, but if you look down at their hands, those fists are getting clenched because they are mad. Voice characteristics. Pitch, tone, repeating, just the rhythm of the words themselves. Are they evasive when you ask them a question? And there's lots of little tricky ways to do this, like, why would you accuse me of doing something like that? Or, well, my answer is da 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 da. Or, I think that's about all I know. Those are all very evasive things. But what happens is a lot of times we go with the message they're implying and not the actual words they're saying. So it's listening to the words that are actually coming out of their mouth. There was a study done that when people were accused of something, truth tellers spontaneously, directly denied 85% of the time during the interview. Liars spontaneously denied 7% of the time. And then the giant one under all of that is the disharmony. Whether you've been working in this field for 8 months or for 25 years, you can get a sixth sense that kind of is telling you that this person in front of me, there's something isn't adding up. Are all of these things kind of going together? So many times our kids that we serve, like you said, they're master manipulators, and they've been working the system for a while, and they figure that out. But every liar will have discrepancies. And so if they've figured out how to get you to like them, you got to put that aside, because you've got to take their discrepancies and what they're presenting as higher than their likability. Niceness and likability is a choice because it manipulates behavior. It gets the power and the control. So looking for that disharmony and detecting that deception. Other practical tips. I know in one of our meetings, Marie said our biggest thing is treat everybody with respect. And I do social work, so I 100% agree with that. This isn't a witch hunt. This isn't going out to try to find somebody who might be doing something. It's about treating everyone with respect, even if they've offended or if they're the victim. Ask questions and don't assume anything. I think one of the biggest lessons that I've learned with this population is overly communicating every boundary and expectation. They need to hear it again and again and again. It covers your butt. It makes it abundantly clear. With some of my kids as a caseworker, I would hug them. Not with everyone, because it would depend on their situation, and we would set those boundaries from the beginning. I will never touch you unless I ask you first. I don't ever want you to touch me unless you ask me first. If you want a hug, it will be a 3-second hug. With some of them, that was enough. With some of them, I actually had to count every time I hugged them. 1, 2, 3. Okay, see you next week. Because they need to keep hearing those boundaries over and over in order to respect them and know where that is. If you remain silent and don't want to address somebody who you feel like could be coming onto you or pushing a boundary or is inappropriate, that to them will imply complicity or vulnerability. And neither of those things are something that you want. Openly discussing situations, bringing other people into the conversation. And then finally, evaluating any potential biases or illusions. Like I said, whether we've been doing this for a few months or many years, we all kind of come in with our own misconceived, preconceived ideas or assumptions. So figuring out what those are. Preventing sexual assault, not only does it benefit you while you're on your shift, it keeps tensions to a minimum, keeps problems to a minimum. It protects the juveniles, but it also is protecting society. Because if juveniles or anybody is assaulted while they're in custody and it is not addressed and it is not handled, the likelihood of them being able to reintegrate into society lessens. They continue to have aggressive behaviors, and they will more than likely end up back in prison as an adult. And that's it.